Did you ever hear about two inmates sentenced to life in prison, who were imprisoned in a prison that is impossible to escape from? They decide to escape from that prison in a crazy way. Did they succeed, and what happened next? Follow the story to the end to find out. Welcome everybody to our channel. In the northern part of the state of New York, in the town of Dannamora, there was a prison that housed the most dangerous murderers and criminals. This prison was considered to be one of the most heavily fortified prisons in the world, with walls made of reinforced concrete that were impossible to penetrate. The walls were 9 meters high and 2 meters thick, and there were guard towers that made it impossible to escape from the prison. In this prison, there was a prisoner named Richard Matt who was serving a life sentence for committing a number of crimes. In 1997, he kidnapped his boss at work, tied him up, and put him in the trunk of his car. He then drove, sometimes stopping to torture the man until the boss died. Matt then took the body to a cabin in the woods, where he chopped it up with a chainsaw and threw it in a river. He then traveled to Mexico, where he killed someone else. He was arrested by the Mexican authorities and imprisoned in Mexico for 9 years. He was then extradited to the United States. While in prison, Matt had always thought about escaping. After 7 years in prison, the idea of escape became an obsession. He started to think of a plan. He went to his friend David Sweat, whose cell was next to his. David was a skilled craftsman and electrician, and he had learned his skills in the prison workshops. David was in prison for killing a police officer and had been sentenced to life in prison. He had been in prison for 12 years. Matt proposed the idea of escaping from prison to David, who agreed. They started to think of a plan. After careful thought, they agreed that the plan would be to open the doors of their cells and escape. They would then go out of the prison building to the western side of the prison yard, where there were fewer guard towers. Once they reached that point, they would climb the wall and escape. However, the problem was that executing this plan would be very difficult. The cell locks were covered with a metal plate secured with special bolts that required a special wrench to open. The prison wall was also very high, and climbing it might be impossible. Then they began thinking about a solution to their problems. Richard, being skilled in persuasion and manipulating people, contemplated enlisting someone to help them acquire the necessary items. He identified the ideal person for their plan within the prison, the supervisor of the sewing workshop. This supervisor was a woman in her 40s named Joyce Mitchell. Richard discovered that Joyce had a troubled relationship with her husband and decided to exploit this fact. He started getting close to her and convincing her that he loved her and wanted to be with her. Over time, Joyce developed feelings for Richard, and they began conversing frequently. Then, Richard started asking Joyce to bring him certain items, such as glasses with lights and inconspicuous objects, to avoid raising suspicion and to build more trust. In one instance, Richard asked Joyce to provide him with some explicit photos of herself. She agreed because of her growing affection for him. Once he had those photos, Richard was able to use them for blackmail. He then requested that she bring him a special type of screwdriver. Joyce agreed and provided it to him. Richard concealed the screwdriver by placing it in his earpiece, effectively bypassing security and metal detection without arousing suspicion. Because in this prison, prisoners are always searched before returning to their cells, and a metal detector is used. However, prisoners are also allowed to use headphones. The important thing is, Richard went to return to his cell, and when he was searched, the metal detector sounded off. But the guards didn't suspect anything and thought it was because of the headphones. And so Richard was able to smuggle the wrench head. Then, Richard and David began trying to unscrew the cell lock bolts using the wrench head. But, after several attempts, they were unable to loosen the bolts, which meant that their plan had failed. However, they did not give up and began to think of another plan. After careful thinking, David suggested using the ventilation shafts in their cells. Behind these shafts was a wide tunnel that they could use to escape. This tunnel was a special pipe tunnel called the cat tunnel. Richard agreed with the idea and began to gather the tools needed to dig through the ventilation shaft. He asked Joyce to bring him a set of small saws, and she did so. Richard then took the saws to the bathroom and hid them inside his chest. Then, he pretended to have stomach pain. A guard named Gene Palmer came and took him back to his cell without searching him. This was a violation of prison policy, as the rules state that prisoners must always be searched before being returned to their cells. In fact, Palmer was a friend of Richard's, and they had an agreement in place. Richard would keep the peace and maintain order in that area of the prison, as he had a strong personality and was respected by the other prisoners. In return, Palmer would grant Richard some privileges. That is why he did not search him before returning him to his cell. However, there was no agreement between them that Palmer would help Richard escape from prison. Richard did not tell Palmer about his plan, and Palmer did not know anything about the saws that Richard was hiding in his chest. Richard was therefore able to obtain the tools he needed to dig. After that, Richard and David waited until nightfall every day to dig through the ventilation shaft. This was because the noise was high in the prison at that time, as most of the prisoners were watching movies at that time. Therefore, no one would hear the sound of digging. After 3 weeks of digging, David was finally able to open the ventilation shaft in his cell. However, he did not immediately go down into the cat tunnel. Instead, he first placed a pile of clothes in his bed and covered it up to make it look like he was sleeping. Richard also stayed up to keep an eye on the guards and distract them if they came near David's cell. After that, David went down into the cat tunnel, which was a series of interconnected tunnels filled with pipes. David continued to go down every night to explore those tunnels and search for a way out. After a full week, he did not find any exit. Richard had also finished digging the ventilation shaft in his cell, but David was the one who continued to go down and explore those tunnels, as Richard was fat and his movement was slow compared to David. After a lot of wandering in those tunnels, David was still unable to find an exit. After that, the two began to think of a backup plan. After careful consideration, they remembered that there was a power station 200 meters from the prison, which provided the prison with electricity and heating. They decided to search for the pipes that connect that station to the prison and use them to escape. David began to search the tunnels for pipes that belonged to the power station. After a lot of searching, which took several nights, David was finally able to find 2 pipes, one of which was labeled in and the other was labeled out. He knew that these were the pipes he was looking for, so he started following them in the hope of crossing under the prison and reaching the power station. After following the pipe, he reached a dead end and found that there was a wall through which the pipe passed. However, that wall was an ordinary wall, not like the solid and thick prison wall that was impossible to break through. He began to dig in that wall with a small saw. After a month of digging, David was once again going down to the tunnel to finish the digging. On the way, he found a box. He opened it and found a large set of tools that he needed to dig, including a hammer that would help him a lot in digging. He was very happy with what he found and then completed the digging process, which became faster thanks to those tools he found. In fact, that box belonged to maintenance workers who came to the prison to carry out repairs. They were always searched before entering the prison, so they were allowed to leave the toolbox there in order to speed up the search process. Anyway, after 2 weeks, David was finally able to open a hole in the wall. He was very happy with what he had done, and then he entered through that hole. After walking for a while, he was surprised by what he saw and was disappointed. He found another wall through which the pipe passed, and the problem was that this wall was the prison wall that was impossible to break through. He returned to his cell feeling disappointed and told Richard what had happened. They decided not to give up and that they would dig and penetrate that wall. Then they started laughing together. After that, they started digging the wall alternately. One day, when David was going to dig, he found a drill in the toolbox. He was very happy with what he found, but that drill did not have drill bits. David went and told Richard what he had found. Richard was very happy with the news, and he began to think of a way to get drill bits. After thinking, he went to Joyce and asked her to bring him drill bits. He told her to hide them in a raw burger patty, then freeze the patty and give it to guard Gene Palmer to deliver to him. Richard's plan worked, and he got what he wanted. In fact, in this prison, prisoners are allowed to buy food from the cafeteria and take it with them to their cells. However, all food must be cooked, and they are not allowed to take uncooked food. However, some guards sometimes break those rules and smuggle uncooked food to prisoners who have a good relationship with them. Since Richard and Gene had a good relationship, Gene delivered the meat without searching it, and he did not know anything about the things hidden in the meat. After that, David took the drill bits and went down to the cat tunnel to dig the wall. When he arrived, he felt a great disappointment because he did not find the toolbox that contained the digging tools and the drill. He was very sad, and there was only a hammer. David told Richard what had happened. They decided that they would finish digging and would not stop. They continued digging alternately for a long time, until summer came. On May 4th, 2015, something happened that changed everything. On that day, David was digging when he noticed that the pipe that passed through the wall was no longer emitting heat like before. He knew that this meant that the pipe was no longer supplying the prison with hot steam, as winter had ended. This meant that this pipe had become their escape route, because the diameter of the pipe was 60 centimeters, which meant that they could pass through it. He was very happy with that, and he told Richard about it. Richard was also happy, and he decided to start a strict diet in order to lose weight so that he could move inside the pipe. David started cutting the pipe to make a hole that would allow them to enter the pipe. After 1 week, he was finally able to open a hole in the pipe. He then entered the pipe and crawled for a certain distance. He then started to open a hole to exit. This time, it was very difficult, as movement inside the pipe was somewhat difficult. After 3 weeks, David was finally able to open the second hole. He then got out of the pipe and started to try to figure out where he was. He smelled a very bad smell, so he knew that he was in the sewers. He was very happy about that. He walked a little and found the manhole. He climbed the ladder and opened the manhole to find himself on the street. He was very happy about that. He thought about running away and not returning to prison, but he eventually returned. He then told Richard, who was very happy. They decided to escape the next day. In the morning of the day of the escape, Richard told Joyce that they would escape that night. He told her to wait for them in her car near the sewer grate. This is because Joyce had agreed with them in advance that she would escape with them to Mexico, and that they would live there. After that, evening came and it was time to escape. The two of them put clothes in their beds and covered them with blankets so that they would look like they were sleeping. Then they entered the cat tunnel and rushed to the pipe and entered it and started crawling. But suddenly, Richard got stuck. He started screaming in fear because he suffered from claustrophobia. David then told him to be quiet so that they would not be discovered. He then threw him a bundle of clothes tied together, and then began to pull him until he was able to get him out and they reached the sewers. Then they rushed to the sewer grate. David went up first. When he stuck his head out and started looking around, he was surprised because he could not find Joyce's car. He went down and told Richard about that. Richard told him to wait for her for a while, so he agreed. After waiting for a quarter of an hour, Joyce did not come, so they decided to escape, because the time for counting the prisoners in the prison was approaching. They quickly left the place. At 5:30 in the morning, the counting of the prisoners in the prison began. The guards discovered that Richard and David had disappeared and exposed the holes in their cells. The alarms were sounded and the security forces were informed of what had happened. Then, the governor of New York State arrived at the prison to see the matter for himself. Then, he spoke at a press conference and said that he would spare no effort to capture the fugitives and would hold all those responsible accountable. After that, a massive search operation for the fugitives began, involving all security forces. The press also covered the events extensively. After 21 days of continuous search, on June 26, 2015, police forces found Richard in a cabin in a county called Franklin, 80 kilometers from the prison. The police surrounded the place, but Richard had a gun and pointed it at the police. The police shoot him and he died. It was later discovered that the gun he had was empty and did not contain any bullets. 2 days later, David was trying to cross the border into Canada. One of the border guards saw him and recognized his identity. He pointed his gun at him and ordered him to stop, but David did not stop and started running. The guard shot him in the foot and he fell to the ground. He was then treated and arrested. He was then interrogated and confessed to everything, including the people who helped them escape. He was then sentenced to an additional life sentence. Guard Gene Palmer was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in prison and a fine of $5,000. Joyce Mitchell was also arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison and a fine of $86,000. The reason that prevented her from going to wait for David and Richard at the sewer grate as they had agreed before was that she was so afraid that she had a panic attack and went to the hospital. Now, this is the end of the story. We hope you enjoyed your time with us. Write for us your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with your friends.